On my first day, a man with perfect teeth turned to the others and whispered, "Let's hope his English is better than his resume." They all laughed. And just like that, my accent walked in the room before I did. The conference table stretched long and glossy. I stood at the far end, holding my coffee with two hands, the way my father did when he needed to hide his shaking fingers. A silence sat thick in the air, not respectful silence, the kind that waits for you to mess up. I introduced myself, carefully shaping every syllable. "My name is Daniel Jin, Strategic Development." No one said welcome, not even a nod. One man, Chad, as I would later learn, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Guess we're getting international now." Laughter, soft but real, the kind that makes your skin itch. I smiled, not because it was funny, but because I had learned something years ago. If you flinch, they win. If you smile, they squint, unsure if you didn't understand, or if you simply chose not to care. But I did care, more than I wanted to admit. You see, I didn't fight my way out of a one-room flat in Busan just to be reduced to a joke in a polished glass tower. By lunch, no one asked me to join them. They filed out in clumps, like schools of fish sensing a predator they couldn't name, only mock. I sat at my desk and opened my packed meal. Kimchi rice, boiled egg. The smell carried, so did the looks. Someone coughed loudly. "Love the aroma," they muttered sarcastically. Again I smiled, not because I liked them, but because I had already beaten worse men than them. The only difference, those men didn't wear suits to hide their fear. And yet something cracked inside me that day, not from their words, those were lightweight stones, but from the realization that in this place, I wouldn't be asked to prove myself. I'd have to fight to be heard, because for them, I wasn't just new. I was foreign, and foreign meant funny accent, funny food, funny name. Not one of them asked where I'd come from. Not one of them knew that I'd built a multi-million-dollar firm back home. Not one of them saw the Harvard degree I didn't frame, because to them, all they heard was how I said strategy, with a hint of soul in my vowels. That night, walking home, I didn't cry. I repeated each word they said to me, memorized the tone, the look, not for revenge, but for fuel, because one day they'd ask me to speak, and I would, not with perfect English, but with undeniable truth. And when that day came, they'd stop laughing and start listening. They say silence speaks volumes, but no one tells you how loud a break room can feel when you're the only one no one will sit beside. The first coffee break came like a test I didn't study for. I walked in with a cautious smile and two hands wrapped around a paper cup that trembled more than I wanted. Steam curled up like smoke signals from home. I nodded at the guy near the sugar packets. "How's it going?" He didn't look up. The woman beside him laughed, but not at anything I said. The table had 6 empty seats. Still they stood. I took the farthest stool by the window, beside the trash bin. My back to them, by choice. Or maybe by quiet resignation. The coffee was bitter. Or maybe it was just the taste of being invisible. I listened to them talk. Their voices were bright and casual until they weren't. A soft snicker cut through the hum of conversation, followed by one voice that tried to whisper, but didn't quite succeed. "Did you catch what he just said?" A pause. What even was that word? Laughter. Subtle. Restrained. The kind that hides behind professionalism, but is still sharp enough to draw blood. They didn't know I could hear them, or maybe they didn't care. Maybe they thought I couldn't understand. But I did. Every word. And worse, I understood the silence between them. They didn't laugh because I said something funny. They laughed because I didn't sound like them, because my vowels stretched too far, or my R's didn't bend the way theirs did, because my sentences carried an echo of another land, another rhythm, another childhood. To them, that was enough to make me a punchline, and still I said nothing. I sat there, eyes on the skyline, stirring a coffee I didn't want to drink anymore. Somewhere outside, a siren screamed. Inside, I swallowed something heavier than bitterness. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to disappointment. The kind you feel when you realize that even adults, even professionals in tailored suits, can act like children, only more cruel because they know better. They finished their break, tossed their cups, and walked past me like I wasn't there. One of them bumped my chair without looking. I looked up just in time to see his badge. I remembered his name, his face, his voice. I remember all of them. Because one day when the room goes quiet for the right reasons, and I'm standing in front of them, not beside them, They'll wonder if I remember, and I will. Not because I hold grudges, but because I build foundations from every stone they throw. And when they finally look up, really look up, they'll see a man who never needed their chair, just his own ground to stand on. Friends, let me pause for just a moment. Would you share with us? Where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something like this? A moment where you felt unseen, unheard, just because you were different? If this story resonates with you, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might need to hear it too. Your support truly helps us grow this channel and keep telling these real, heartfelt stories. Now, let's continue. The screen lit up like it always did, bright and clean and cold. 12 rectangles, 12 faces, and mine, 13th. A little lower, a little dimmer. Always last to unmute, always the first to be overlooked. Monday's strategy meeting. They called it collaborative. But no one was really listening to build, only waiting for their turn to talk. And me? I wasn't just waiting. I was hoping. Hoping that this time I'd be allowed to finish a sentence before someone decided it wasn't worth hearing. When it got to me, I spoke slowly, intentionally, not out of insecurity, but because I'd trained myself to do so. I'd learned to clip certain syllables, stretch others, swap sounds that felt too foreign for their comfort. Based on the data from last quarter, we could reposition the product with a chuckle, muffled. Then a voice cut in, casual, careless. Sorry, didn't catch that. They always said that, even when I spoke clearly, even when the words were simpler than the ones they used, even when I repeated myself the same way I'd rehearsed the night before. They didn't want to catch it, because hearing me meant acknowledging me, and acknowledging me meant making room. I tried again, more deliberate, shorter phrases, smaller ideas. I could almost hear my old literature professor in soul. Don't shrink your mind for small rooms, Daniel. But here I was, shrinking, not because I wanted to, because I was learning that sometimes survival looks like silence with a smile. As I spoke, I watched their eyes, not the ones looking directly at me, the ones in other boxes. Side glances, raised eyebrows, a smirk that disappeared the moment I looked up. They didn't say it, but I knew what they were thinking. I'd seen that look before. In schoolyards where my brother was pushed down because of the lunch our mother packed. In elevators where people laughed after we stepped off. In banks where they looked at my father's paperwork and said, "Sorry, we don't offer those types of loans." Now here in this virtual boardroom, I saw the same eyes. Only this time they wore tailored shirts and smiled for the camera. One of the senior managers, David, spoke up after me. He said exactly what I'd just said, almost word for word, but with a polished voice. With all the right pauses, the right intonation, the right accent. This time the boxes lit up green. Great insight, David. Let's go in that direction. Even the head of product nodded. I sat still, not angry, not even surprised anymore. It wasn't just that my ideas were unheard. It was that they were unclaimed until someone else made them palatable. And still I smiled. Because I knew something they didn't. They thought I was trying to prove myself. But the truth is, I had already proven myself long before I walked into their call. They didn't know about the hospital I helped fund in my mother's name, or the company I built in Singapore that now employed over 100 people, or the night I flew 19 hours to pitch in broken French to secure a deal no one else could close. To them I was just the guy with the accent. But to others, back home, overseas, even across time zones, I was a voice they trusted. I wasn't asking for validation. I was offering value, and if they couldn't see that, then the loss wasn't mine. It was theirs. The call ended. Screens flickered off. The quiet returned. And I stayed there, still, alone in a room full of potential, my reflection staring back from the dark monitor, lit only by the early dusk slipping through the blinds. I reached into my drawer and pulled out the notebook I kept for moments like this. At the top of a clean page I wrote, "They didn't catch that. One day they'll catch up." And beneath it, my next idea. Sharper than the last, not louder, just undeniable. Because I wasn't here to echo their voices, I was here to make them remember mine. The conference room smelled like polished ambition, leather chairs, fresh coffee, and something colder beneath it all. Approval, the kind you chase but never quite touch. I had worked for weeks on the presentation, every slide refined, every chart aligned, every word rehearsed, until even the pauses felt like punctuation marks. They called it a visibility opportunity, a chance to showcase my strategy to the regional leads. I knew what it really was. A test, not of knowledge, not of results, of tolerance. Would they endure 5 minutes of a voice like mine? I walked up to the screen, nodded, smiled the way they liked. Polite, but not too proud. Humble, but confident. A careful balance I had mastered like walking a tightrope in wind. The presentation began. Market growth, emerging regions, infrastructure gaps. They listened, some more than others. Phones flashed beneath the table. A yawn was stifled behind a hand. But when I reached the slide about my proposal, I paused. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't guesswork, that I had spent years preparing for this moment. So I spoke, not of numbers, but of where I came from. I earned my master's in public policy at Harvard. A glance up. Before that, I trained in Seoul and later in Zurich, where I focused on international market behavior. That got their attention. A few brows lifted, a head tilted, surprised. For a moment there was silence. Then the manager leaned forward, the one with the expensive pen and the well-practiced grin. He nodded once, slowly, then said, "Impressive, but we value communication skills here." And just like that, everything I had built collapsed under one sentence. He didn't mean the words. He meant the sound. Because in that moment, he didn't see Harvard. He didn't see Seoul. He didn't see Zurich. He saw a man whose vowels curved differently. A man whose confidence was translated, not born of his world. I felt the temperature in the room shift, like the air had turned thicker, heavier. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. No one objected. No one said, "Actually, that was insightful." They just moved on, like credentials were decoration, like my work had to come with subtitles. I stood for the rest of the meeting, quiet, smiling still, because that's what I was taught. Never let them see you bleed, even when they cut you with praise. When it ended, someone came up to me and said, "Don't take it personally, he's just old school." But it wasn't age, it was fear. Fear of a voice that didn't ask for permission. Fear of a resume that crossed borders they never had to. That night, I walked home slower than usual. Not from defeat, but from weight. The weight of knowing I had to be twice as prepared, 3 times as calm and endlessly resilient, just to be called almost enough. I passed a street musician playing something soft and broken on a violin. The tune wavered, off-tempo, imperfect, but beautiful. People walked by. No one applauded. No one dropped coins. But I stopped, because it reminded me of something. Truth doesn't need to be perfect to be powerful, and neither did my voice. I went home, opened my laptop, and rewrote my pitch. Not to make it clearer. To make it mine, because I wasn't going to keep apologizing for how I sound when I've already proven what I know. They could overlook my degrees. They could dismiss my experience. But they couldn't erase the truth I carried, and the day would come when they'd stop measuring my worth by how comfortable I made them feel, and start reckoning with what I came to build. The cafeteria was bright, almost sterile. Light poured in through the tall windows, bouncing off white walls and gleaming floors. So clean, so curated, it felt more like a showroom than a place to rest. I came early that day, not because I was hungry, but because I was tired. Tired of standing alone in corners, of pretending I didn't notice how the room would reshape itself around my presence. So I chose the center table, the one where everyone usually sat, the one where conversations flowed easily, where laughter lived. I placed my tray down carefully, almost reverently, as if claiming not just a seat, but the right to belong. I unpacked my lunch, homemade japchae packed neatly in a bento box my sister gave me before I moved here. It still had the faded sticker on the lid. "You are stronger than you think." I smiled at it. I believed it most days. The noodles let off a gentle aroma, sweet, savory, familiar, comfort from 1,000 miles away. I waited. One by one they entered, voices rising, shoes clicking, laughter blooming behind polite hellos. They saw me. Of course they did. A few slowed their steps. A few hesitated, and then quietly, subtly, they rerouted. Around me, around the table, as if my presence had made the space smaller, unwelcoming, as if the air itself had shifted, and they preferred not to breathe it. Someone muttered something under their breath, not cruel, not loud, just dismissive. A sideways glance, a turned shoulder. They took seats near the windows. Some stood. One leaned against the vending machine like it was more comfortable than sitting 2 feet away from me. They didn't speak to me, not out of rudeness, but something colder, indifference, the kind that slices without effort. I looked down at my lunch. My stomach clenched, not from hunger, from something lonelier. I chewed slowly, carefully, as if eating too loudly might confirm their assumptions, as if I had to apologize for existing in their field of view. No one made a scene. No one said anything cruel. And yet I felt erased, not hated, just unseen. And that's what stung the most. Hatred, I could have fought. Mockery, I could have answered. But invisibility? It's hard to fight what won't even look at you. I finished my meal in silence, the sounds of their conversation drifting over like wind through a closed window. They talked about shows I didn't watch, bars I didn't visit, memories I wasn't invited to make. I rose, tray in hand, and walked to the bins. And just before I left, I glanced back. One of them, newer, younger, looked at me, just for a second. Not with cruelty, not with kindness. With guilt, but he said nothing. And I understood. He wasn't ready to lose his seat for acknowledging mine. I stepped into the hallway. The hum of the office wrapped around me again, familiar, cold, manageable. And as I walked, I whispered quietly, "Your silence doesn't shrink me. It only sharpens me. Because loyalty isn't who laughs with you in comfort. It's who sits beside you in discomfort. And if I had to sit alone every day to keep my dignity intact, then so be it. Because I wasn't building popularity. I was building legacy. And legacies are never built at safe tables." The music was loud, but not enough to drown out the undercurrent. It was the annual company party. A casual mixer, they called it. Drinks flowed, ties loosened, laughter filled the corners. People who barely said hello in meetings now danced like old friends. A night to celebrate, they said. But not everyone was invited in the same way. Some came to be seen, others just to blend into the background. I showed up late, on purpose. My suit was neat, pressed, my shoes quiet on the tile. I wasn't here to impress, just to show up. Just to remind them I was still here, still standing, still building something they didn't yet understand. I moved through the room like a ghost. Nodded, smiled, the usual. I stepped toward the refreshment table, pretending to check my phone, pretending to look occupied. It was easier than standing still. And then as I walked past one of the clusters of co-workers near the bar where the jokes got bolder and the filters loosened, I heard it, a stretched-out voice, mocking, overacted. "Wir exten Projekt?" And laughter followed, the kind that doesn't try to hide. My back stiffened. I didn't stop walking, but I didn't need to turn to know. It was me. It was my voice they were mimicking, not my idea, not my strategy. Just the way my words bent around their language. That was enough for a joke. I reached the table, gripped the glass too tightly. The ice clinked like small betrayals. Behind me I heard another voice, quieter, almost a whisper, but meant to be heard. "Don't let him pitch. He'll scare the client off." Laughter again, softer this time. Not because it lost humor, because it gained meanness. I stood there still, my throat tight, my chest hollow. Not because of the insult, but because of the familiarity. It brought me back to a classroom where my hand was always the last one chosen. To a job interview where the manager smiled and said, "Your qualifications are excellent, but do you think you'd fit in with the team?" Back to a train platform in Berlin where someone laughed behind me and mimicked my words into their friend's ear. Different countries. Same rhythm, same mockery. I never thought I'd carry that echo into a room full of professionals. But here I was, years of experience, degrees from 3 countries, and still reduced to a caricature. I turned my back to the room and looked out the window. City lights blinked in the distance, alive, unjudging. I imagined my mother's hands, bruised from sewing late into the night, just to pay for my first language course. I imagined my father, who never learned English, practicing the phrase, "My son is manager," over and over so he could say it with pride when anyone asked. Would he still be proud now? If he knew that the world I'd fought so hard to enter still laughed the same way they did it at him. I didn't confront them. I didn't yell. Because my silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. I wasn't going to waste my voice correcting boys in men's clothing. Instead, I walked out of the room, stepped into the hallway, and whispered to myself, not in perfect English, but in perfect clarity. They can mock the sound, but they can't unbuild what I've built. And one day they'll ask me to speak. And I will. Not for them, but for every child who's ever stayed silent in shame. For every father who worked 3 jobs to buy a textbook. For every voice they tried to laugh into silence. Because this accent they mocked, it wasn't a weakness. It was survival with syllables. It was a map of every country I had crossed, every fear I had outgrown, every room I had entered where I wasn't welcome and stayed anyway. They laughed, yes, but one day they'd quote me. There's a moment, quiet, unremarkable, when something inside you tightens too far, and you know, if it turns one more time, it breaks. For me, that moment didn't come with shouts. It came in the silence after the laughter. I lay in bed that night, fully clothed, shoes still on, the office pass still hanging from my neck like a chain I hadn't yet chosen to remove. The laughter echoed, not loud, not even vivid, but persistent. A low hum at the back of my mind that wouldn't shut off. The way they twisted my words, dragged my voice into the dirt, and then laughed like children daring each other to poke something they didn't understand. I stared at the ceiling and asked the question I'd avoided since I walked into that company. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe this wasn't the space I thought it was. Maybe they were right, and I was forcing something that didn't fit. Like trying to translate poetry, word for word, only to lose all the beauty in the process. I felt it deep, like a stone pressing on my chest. Shame, not for who I was, but for ever thinking they'd see me for who I am. I got up. No lights. Just the soft glow of the hallway, bleeding into the apartment like fog. I went to the small desk near the window, the one I bought used my first week in the city. Still had the scratches from whoever owned it before. Still wobbled on one leg. On that desk was my notebook, leather-bound, pages warped slightly from use. Inside, my strategy. Pages of thoughts, projections, pivots. A full year of market models, global rollout frameworks, brand positioning tailored to emerging regions they hadn't even considered, ideas they never asked for, ideas I still brought because I believed they mattered. I flipped through the pages slowly, my handwriting shaky in the early pages, steadier now, my ideas more daring, more refined, not louder, just sharper. And as I turned each page, something returned. Not pride, not confidence, memory. I remembered the time I was rejected from a job in London, only to get a call 6 months later from the same company asking if I could train their new international team. I remembered pitching a product to a room full of investors who spoke over me, until I showed them I had already secured funding from a source they didn't know existed. I remembered nights when I couldn't sleep from self-doubt, and mornings when I walked into rooms anyway. They had underestimated me, so had others before, and every time they made the same mistake. They confused quiet with weak. They confused difference with lesser. They confused my patience with permission. But I wasn't here to be liked. I was here to build. And the only reason I hadn't left yet was because I hadn't finished showing them what they missed when they weren't listening. I closed the notebook, stood still, and took a deep breath. Not the kind that calms you down, the kind that calls you back. Back to who you are. Back to why you began. Back to the truth that doesn't bend, even when your knees do. The breaking point never came. Not that night. Because it turned out I wasn't breaking. I was becoming. They had tried to shrink me. With stares. With jokes. With polite dismissals. But I wasn't shrinking. I was sharpening. And soon the words they'd mocked would become the message they couldn't ignore. The accent they laughed at would one day speak the decision that changed everything. And on that day, I'd no longer need a seat at their table. Because I'd be building my own. The office was silent long after the last heel had clicked out the door. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the soft whir of the old ventilation system were the only sounds left, like a heartbeat reminding the walls they were still alive. Everyone else had gone home hours ago, to dinners, to spouses, to sleep they believed they had earned. I stayed, not out of duty, out of purpose. The clock on the wall blinked 10:43 p.m. To them it was late. To me it was perfect. Because on the other side of the world the morning sun was rising, and with it, the people I had worked for months to reach. I plugged in my headset, laid out my notes, checked the numbers again, and made the call. No one asked me to do this. In fact, when I had suggested the Southeast Asia expansion back in Q1, it had been politely dismissed. A distraction, they'd called it. Too soon, too uncertain. But I had seen the signs. The gap, the need, the potential. So I built the deck anyway, reached out anyway, cultivated the relationships anyway. And now, at nearly midnight in a half-lit office, I was speaking to men and women who didn't care about my accent, only the substance behind it. The conversation wasn't easy. There were pauses, clarifications, cultural nuances to navigate, but we spoke the same language where it mattered: vision, risk, trust. And when the call ended, the deal was done. A 7-figure partnership, 3 regional markets, 2 years of projected growth, closed in a language they'd said would hold me back. Delivered by a man they refused to let speak at meetings. I leaned back in my chair. My spine ached, my eyes burned, but I felt more awake than I had in months. Not because of pride, but because I knew I had just changed the game. Not only for them, for me. I packed my bag slowly, took one last look at the quiet room, and walked into the night, the cold air like a blessing on my skin. The next morning I arrived early. Same desk, same coffee, same nods from passing coworkers. Brief, distracted, shallow. No one asked why I looked tired. No one noticed the unread email marked urgent with the signed contract inside. No one stopped by my desk. No announcement. No mention in the morning huddle. No recognition. Because the truth was simple. They didn't know what they had. Not yet. And a part of me wondered, if I told them, would they even believe it? Or would they find a way to rewrite the story? Claim it was luck. Claim someone else helped. Claim it didn't really matter, but it did matter. It mattered to the partners across the ocean who saw value where others saw barrier. It mattered to the future clients who'd benefit from a door that had just been opened. And it mattered to the younger version of me, the boy who once stayed after class to practice speaking into a mirror because no one would wait long enough to listen. So I didn't brag. I didn't boast. I let the silence stay. Because I've learned something powerful in this journey. When they ignore what you do in the dark, they'll be shocked by what you reveal in the light. And when that day comes, when the results they can't explain start reshaping the ground they walk on, they'll wonder how it happened. When it happened, who made it happen? And I'll be there. Not to say I told you so, but to finally say, you never had to hear me, but you will see me. The room was dressed in tension. You could feel it in the stiff suits, the restless glances at watches, the shallow breaths masked by polite smiles. The biggest client pitch of the quarter, a global player. The kind of account that gets names printed in annual reports and bonuses padded for years. Everyone in leadership was here. Everyone who mattered, at least by their standards. Except me. I wasn't on the agenda. I wasn't on the slides. I wasn't even on the seating chart. Despite having built half the research they were about to present, despite staying up late rechecking figures that would be delivered in someone else's polished voice, I sat in the back of the room. No title on the table in front of me. No introduction. No nod of recognition. I watched as they prepared, cords tangled, laptops blinking, AV stalling. The lead presenter fumbled. Then the screen went black. A murmur spread. A technician ran in, then out again, mumbling about backups and faulty HDMI ports. Panic began to bloom. The client team shifted in their seats, whispering. Someone yawned, clearly unimpressed. Another checked their phone. Every second stretched thinner, heavier, and that's when it happened. The manager, the same one who once told me my credentials were impressive, but not what we need, stood up, his voice tight with urgency. Is anyone here able to step in, just to hold the room while we fix this? Eyes darted. No one moved. No one wanted to risk stumbling through half-prepared slides or unrehearsed data. The pressure was too high. The room was too cold. And failure would be remembered. I stood. I didn't ask. I didn't wait. I simply rose and walked forward. I can. The room turned. A flicker of confusion. A beat of disbelief. I didn't care. I picked up the remote. The screen was still dead. So I spoke without it. No crutch. No visuals. Just my voice, the one they had dismissed, mocked, sidelined. But I knew the data. I knew the story behind the numbers. I knew the client's pain points, not because I had memorized them, but because I had studied them, felt them, traced them through late-night calls and research no one else had time for. So I told a story about growth, about trust, about how our product could meet not only the client's needs, but their future. I didn't overcomplicate. I didn't oversell. I simply connected. I watched their posture shift. The man with the crossed arms now leaned forward. The woman who had been scrolling put her phone down. Their CEO nodded once, then twice. Minutes passed. The technician finally fixed the screen, but we didn't need it anymore. When I finished, the room was silent, not empty, present. And then came the words I never forgot. Why wasn't he leading this from the start? No one answered, because the real answer was too uncomfortable. I wasn't meant to lead. I was meant to assist. I was meant to be reliable but invisible. But when everything broke, when their structure collapsed, it was my foundation they stood on. I didn't smile. Not yet. I stepped back, returned to my seat, and folded my hands. The meeting resumed, and everything changed, even if no one said it out loud. They didn't invite me to speak, but they couldn't deny that I had. And after that day, they never looked at me the same. Not because they finally understood me, but because they finally needed me. I was no longer just the guy with the accent. I was the voice that saved their silence. There's a silence that doesn't mean absence, it means presence. It came after I spoke, not the awkward hush of confusion, not the cold pause that follows a forced politeness. This was different, the kind of stillness that only follows something real. A room full of executives, analysts, and decision-makers sitting in perfect, stunned quiet. Not because they didn't understand me, but because they finally did. It didn't begin with authority. It began with breath. I took one before I spoke, deep, steady. Not to calm myself, but to center. And then I spoke, not in apology, not in translation, but in truth. I opened in English, clear, direct, firm. I laid out the data, numbers I'd lived with for months, crunched and corrected down to the decimal. But I didn't just give them figures. I gave them the why, what those numbers meant, what lives they touched, what futures they could shape. Then I shifted into Korean, just for a moment, to speak directly to the representative who had flown in from Seoul. I honored his presence not with subtitles, but with respect. His eyes lit up not from novelty, but recognition. For once, he wasn't being asked to adjust. He was being seen. And finally, I pivoted into French, because the client's European division had brought their CFO, and I knew she struggled to follow fast English. I didn't do it to impress. I did it because I could. Because all my life, I had been bending, learning, adapting, and now all those years of effort weren't something to hide. They were the edge. The reason I could do what no one else in the room could. I told the story of our product, not as a script, but as a journey. Not just where it was going, but where it came from. Why it mattered? What it would feel like in the hands of someone who needed it. I made the data human, the metrics emotional, the market personal. The projector flickered behind me, barely needed. The graphs on the screen became secondary to the rhythm in the room. Because in that moment, I wasn't just giving a pitch. I was reclaiming my voice, the one they tried to mute in meetings, the one they mimicked behind my back, the one they filtered through their doubts, their biases, their fear of the unfamiliar. And now that very voice was leading them, not demanding attention, commanding it quietly, powerfully. I didn't raise my volume. I raised truth, and they listened. When I finished, I looked around. Their faces were different. No smirks, no side eyes, just stillness. And then a breath, collective, soft, reverent, the kind people take when they realize they almost missed something important, something bigger than them, something they didn't know they needed until it stood in front of them and refused to be ignored. In that moment, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel foreign. I didn't feel lucky to be in the room. I felt rightfully placed, not because they finally approved, but because I no longer cared whether they did. My voice had spoken, not for permission, not for validation, but because it had something to say. And now, they would never forget the sound of it. The room felt electric, like the moment just before a storm breaks. As I clicked the final slide, the silence hung heavy, charged with something I'd never experienced here before. Genuine anticipation. The client's smile broke first, slow, almost hesitant, as if he was checking whether it was real. Then it bloomed, full and unguarded. Behind him, his boss rose from the chair, the tallest figure in the room, now feeling small before the truth of what they'd just heard. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a business card, his own, and held it out to me. No fanfare, no hesitation. That was brilliant. May I have your card? The words echoed, a single simple request that carried the weight of every doubt they'd ever had. One of my so-called colleagues stood frozen, hand at their mouth, eyes wide. Another dropped a pen onto the polished table. The click sounded deafening. Heads turned, jaws slackened, and for a moment the entire team was unmoored, caught between disbelief and admiration. I reached into my jacket pocket, my fingers steady. No tremor. Nothing in my hand but a small rectangle of thick paper. My own card, printed with my name and title. The accent in my surname, a reminder of where I came from. I placed it in his palm. Their applause started quietly, one hesitant clap from the client's CFO, then grew like ripples in a pond. Soon the entire room was on its feet, hands meeting in a thunderous rush that rattled the windows. It wasn't the polite, perfunctory applause I'd heard before. This was wholehearted, unrestrained. I felt my chest tighten, not from pride, but from something deeper. Validation had finally found its way back to me, not because I'd sought it, but because I earned it. In that collective sound, I heard more than approval. I heard respect, recognition, a shift in power as palpable as the snap of a closing deal. As the claps echoed around me, I looked at each face. The client who had doubted me just weeks ago. The boss whose eyes shone with newfound certainty. My team, mouths agape, coming to terms with the force they had underestimated. And in that wave of astonished faces, I saw the turning point of my story. I folded my hands in front of me, the applause washing over my shoulders like a tide. My voice came low and calm, though it didn't need to be heard over the clamor. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The moment was mine. When the final claps faded, the silence that followed held no threat. It held promise. Because I knew that from now on, every meeting would start differently. Every voice would carry a little more space for mine. And as I stepped back from the table, I felt the weight of all the past chapters lift. The laughter, the cold shoulders, the mocking voices. They receded behind me, replaced by this. The unexpected applause that heralded the day they finally heard me. They came after the storm had passed, when the chairs were being tucked back under the conference table, when the client's laughter had already faded into the hallway, when the projector screen went blank, and the weight of silence no longer felt threatening, but strangely full. I stayed behind, not for recognition, not for attention, just to breathe. To feel the aftermath with my own 2 feet on the floor, to quietly trace what had just happened. The room that once treated my voice like background noise now sat still in the wake of it, like something sacred had passed through, and they weren't quite sure how to name it. And then the first one came. He walked toward me with the same shoulders that used to turn the other way in meetings. His eyes shifted slightly, part guilt, part awe. He stopped short of standing too close, as if unsure whether he had the right. Honestly, I didn't know you had that in you. His voice was coated with surprise, but not admiration. Not yet. More like someone realizing they'd walked past a closed door their whole life, never knowing there was a cathedral behind it. I smiled politely, not coldly, not warmly. Just enough. Another followed, then another, and another. Their words varied, but the subtext never did. You were incredible. Why didn't you ever speak up before? I had no idea you could present like that. Wish we had put you up there sooner. Honestly, we should have been learning from you this whole time. Each sentence was a confession wrapped in compliment. Each smile was a crack in the armor they had worn for months. They weren't praising me. They were apologizing without ever saying the word. One of the senior leads, the same man who once talked over me on every call, stood awkwardly by the door. He rubbed the back of his neck like a child caught lying. That pitch, Daniel, that was next level. I mean it. He said it like he was trying to make peace with something inside himself, like he was asking for permission to rewrite history. But I remembered the meetings, the silence, the way he used to tilt his head in fake confusion every time I spoke. I remembered it all, and now all they could offer was delayed acknowledgement. But by then, I had already outgrown the need for it. Because the truth is, applause that comes too late doesn't carry the weight of praise. It carries the weight of regret. They regretted not listening, not noticing, not valuing, and now, in the face of something undeniable, they wanted to make amends, carefully, tentatively, like travelers arriving at a destination they never believed existed. But I was no longer standing there to be discovered. I had already arrived. One woman, the only one who had once tried to include me in conversation weeks ago, approached last. Her voice was quiet, I'm sorry for not speaking up sooner. I should have. That one I believed, because she had seen more than most, and said less than she should have. But now at least she said something. I nodded gently. Forgiveness doesn't always need words. Sometimes silence can hold grace too. But I wasn't the same man who had once waited by the coffee machine hoping someone would say hello. I wasn't the one who softened his voice in meetings just to be less noticeable. That man had served his time. He had paid his price, and now he had stepped aside, so I could take the place I had earned, not with force, but with truth. The shift in the room wasn't in their hearts. It was in their eyes. The way they looked at me now, as if seeing something they couldn't quite understand but could no longer ignore. And that was enough. Because the day you no longer need their recognition to feel your worth is the day they start offering it, uninvited, unasked, and too late. They spoke at last. But I had already learned the most important thing. I didn't rise because they opened the door. I rose because I built a way in. And now that I was inside, I wasn't waiting for their welcome anymore. He asked to see me in private. It was the first time he had done that. Not in passing, not in a hallway nod, not in a brief Slack message that ended with a thumbs-up emoji. No, this was intentional. Face to face, behind a closed door. His office, not mine. The kind of meeting that usually signals a promotion, a warning, or a reckoning. The blinds were half drawn. Sunlight spilled in strips across the floor, lighting parts of the room and leaving others in shadow. It felt poetic in a way I didn't want to admit. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. I sat, not because I was told to, but because I chose to. There's a quiet power in that, after so many months of swallowing silence, of occupying only the spaces offered. He cleared his throat. His tie was slightly loose. A man preparing to unbutton something deeper than fabric. He started talking, slowly, awkwardly, like someone walking barefoot across gravel. Look, I may have underestimated you. He paused as if expecting my face to shift, to soften, maybe even smile. But I didn't. I had nothing to offer him but presence. I had already given him more grace than he deserved. I try to keep the team cohesive, he continued, and sometimes that means making tough calls. You know how it is. Not everyone fits right away. There it was, wrapped in polished excuses. Still trying to name prejudice as strategy. Still confusing exclusion with leadership. Still refusing to say the word bias. He was trying to rewrite history politely, to label my sidelining as some noble sacrifice made in the name of team unity, as if the months I spent being unheard were a necessary trade-off, as if I was the disruption, not the truth I carried. I sat still. Let him finish. He didn't ask for forgiveness, not directly. Just hoped that time had dulled the sharpness of memory. But time doesn't erase what happens when you're mocked behind your back in your second language. Time doesn't mute the sound of your own ideas repeated without credit. Time doesn't smooth over the nights spent wondering if being yourself is a professional liability. So I spoke, not to accuse, not to comfort, just to correct. You didn't underestimate me, I said. You dismissed me. You feared what you didn't understand. That's not underestimation, that's contempt. Quiet and clean, but no less cruel. He blinked, as if the word contempt hadn't occurred to him before, as if it wasn't the very foundation of every decision he had made about me. He tried to speak again, but I raised my hand, calmly, firmly. I didn't need more words. I didn't need another explanation crafted to make him feel better about my pain, because I hadn't come for an apology, and I didn't need one. I came because I had the right to be in that room now, on equal ground, not as someone waiting for approval, but as someone no longer asking. He nodded, a small, unsure nod, the kind that meant he didn't know what to say now that the script had been broken. I stood, straightened my sleeves, looked him in the eyes, not with anger, but with clarity. There is a kind of silence that doesn't submit. It declares, and in that moment, mine said everything. You don't get to rewrite this story, now that it's winning. You don't get to decorate the truth you tried to bury. And you certainly don't get to call your fear strategy. I walked out of that office not vindicated, just realigned, because I finally understood. His opinion had never defined my worth, only delayed its recognition. And the next time he introduced me to someone new, his voice would carry a different weight. Not because he respected me now, but because now he knew the cost of not listening. The offer came in the form of an email, polished, formal, crafted with care as if language could soften the weight of what it asked. Subject line: New opportunity, let's discuss. I didn't open it right away, not because I wasn't curious, but because I already knew what was inside, after the applause, after the client's handshake, after the card exchange and the echo of my voice still ringing in the halls, where it had once been silenced. Now they were ready to offer me what they had once withheld: a leadership role, visibility, a project with reach and resources, and a title with more syllables. I stared at the emails that glowed on my screen. Everything I had once fought for was now being offered, freely, conveniently, publicly, and yet all I could feel was stillness. Not pride, not satisfaction, just peace, because I no longer needed it. The meeting to discuss next steps was scheduled for Tuesday at 10. I showed up not because I wanted the role, but because some conversations deserved to be answered in person. The conference room had that same corporate scent: fresh coffee and artificial achievement. The people at the table were smiling more than usual. Their words were light, eager, preemptively celebratory. We'd love for you to lead this initiative. You've more than proven yourself. This is the perfect time for your voice to shape the vision. It was almost comical how quickly the tone had shifted. Months ago, my voice was inconvenient. Now it was indispensable. Once a liability, now a selling point. But they didn't know. I had already made my decision. When they finished speaking, the room went quiet, expectant. I didn't hesitate, not out of pride, but out of clarity. Thank you, I said, but I'm building something of my own. They blinked, uncertain, confused. Elsewhere, I added, where voices like mine aren't just tolerated after proving themselves, but welcomed from the start. The room stiffened. Their smiles faltered. Where my accent isn't something to overcome, but something that enriches the room. Where I don't have to outperform tenfold just to be heard. Where I don't have to ask for space, because I'm already invited to the table. They said nothing, because what could they say? I stood, pushed the chair back gently, looked each of them in the eye, not with anger, but with finality. You laughed at my voice, I said quietly, until others listened. But I don't need to stay where I had to fight to be heard. I'm going where the fight is already won, and where the work begins with respect, not reluctance. They sat frozen, surprised, disarmed, but I didn't walk out with vengeance. I walked out with freedom, because the greatest success isn't being accepted by those who doubted you. It's choosing to no longer need their permission. And as I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps felt lighter than they ever had in that building, not because the weight was gone, but because I had finally put it down. A week later it arrived, not as a phone call, not as an internal announcement, not as another backhanded compliment passed over coffee. It came quietly, early morning, just as the sun broke the edges of my apartment window. A notification blinked on my screen. You've been mentioned in an article. I clicked, slowly, cautiously, like opening a door you once had to knock on with trembling hands. And there it was. Front page of a major industry journal. My name, spelled correctly, accent mark intact. Bold, clear, untouched. No abbreviation. No trimming to make it easier to pronounce. Just mine, whole. Global Strategies by Daniel Jin. How Cultural Intelligence is Reshaping the Industry. I read it once, then again, and then I just sat there, letting the words breathe around me. They quoted me. Not my numbers, not my bullet points, my voice. The same voice they had once talked over in meetings. The same voice someone once mimicked at a party, pulling my syllables like rubber bands. The same voice that was once met with smirks, sighs, and, "Could you just slow down a little?" That voice was now being cited, not questioned, not corrected, celebrated. The article spoke of vision, of cross-market empathy, of global adaptability. They used phrases like emotional fluency and linguistic resilience. They mentioned how companies must now listen more than they speak, and how leadership in the next decade will belong to those who understand not just markets, but people. And in every line, I felt the ghost of who I used to be slowly dissolving. The boy who practiced American vowels in front of a bathroom mirror. The man who stayed silent during meetings while others repeated his ideas. The employee who once sat alone at the edge of a lunchroom table, pretending not to notice. And yet, this victory wasn't a middle finger. It wasn't revenge. It was redemption. Because I didn't win by becoming louder. I won by becoming unshakably myself. I didn't trim my accent to make it more palatable. I didn't change my name to make it more comfortable. I didn't wait for a seat, I built a platform. And now the very thing they tried to edit out of me had become my signature. Later that day, I got messages from former coworkers, from industry peers, from interns who had once watched me from a distance. Just read the article. Proud to say I worked with you. Wish I'd said something sooner, but I no longer needed their recognition. Their late applause couldn't compare to the sound I now trusted most. My own voice, unchanged, unpolished, undefeated. That night, I walked home through the city. No headphones. Just the hum of traffic and the sound of my shoes against pavement. And for the first time in years, I didn't replay old conversations in my head. Didn't rework sentences to sound less foreign. Didn't shrink my thoughts into what I thought people wanted to hear. I just walked, tall, quiet, whole. And as I passed the mirrored glass of a storefront, I caught my reflection and whispered to it, "This voice was never a flaw. It was a flag, and now that it's raised, let them look up to it, the same way they once looked down."